Well, here we are. A few months ago, I did a video on the sacking of the Yuan Ming Yuan, also known as the Chinese Summer Palace outside of Beijing in 1860 by the British and French forces following the Opium Wars. And it was pretty well received. A lot of people liked it. It got a lot of people looking at it in China. And I began thinking about, well, what happened to the loot? What happened to all the stuff? Where did it all go? Because if you look at the history books, according to the British and the French, they got a couple of things and it wasn't that big of a deal. And I want to go into that a little bit and talk about where these objects are today and how many of them there are around that we can find, and what their future is, really, is what it amounts to. But before I get into it, I think it's a good idea to sort of revisit what led up to the sacking of the Yuan Ming Yuan in October of 1860 by the British and the French, and its subsequent destruction physically of the complex's 3,000 buildings on the 18th of October by the British in retaliation, because there's a lot of nonsense that has been told about what really happened. And I've spent a lot of time in the last few months digging out documents and papers published by some of the British museums and other sources to see where the stuff went, who did what and when. And it's a pretty breathtaking difference between what the British official history of the story is and what really happened. And I want to get into that because it's a bit of an eye-opener. It basically all began in the 18th century. When the British were doing trade. The East India Company, which many of you know is the largest corporation in the history of the world, even to this day. They had their own standing army of around 250,000 soldiers. They were the financial business side, basically, of the British government. They were a corporation that shared their profits with the crown and other nobles, and it was basically a corporation run amok, is what happened. And they were occupying when Britain invaded and took over India and colonized it. The EIC, the East India Company, began producing opium there because opium grows well in that country and so forth. And they began shipping it around the world, in particular to China. And opium was illegal in China. It had been used there historically in the past by the wealthy classes, sort of as a fancy, a luxury good that was occasionally used, but it wasn't a problem. People were not abusing it all over the place and so forth. But at any event, the Chinese were visited by a fellow named McCarthy, the Emperor Qianlong, in the early 1790s, gave him an audience, and he came in begging for the Chinese to open up their borders and to permit more ports of trade and for longer periods of time during the year, rather than during just the trading season through the Hongs, which was the old system, the Celestial Empire system that they had going back centuries in Canton and so forth. They had a control over who could come into the country, who couldn't, what months of the year you could come and so forth, because the Chinese weren't buying anything really from the West. They traded very little with the West because they had everything that they really needed. But the Chinese were selling them huge amounts of stuff, and it was causing a trade deficit. And the British thought a great way to fund operations in India and to pay for that colony and offset some of the expenses was to sell the Chinese opium. This was their plan, even though it was completely illegal, and they were told so by the Emperor Qianlong in the 1790s when McCarthy went to see him. They said, no, we don't want you bringing in opium. And this was a big problem. This was a big problem for the English and what they were going to do about it, and it became a growing problem for the Chinese as it got into the early 19th century and up to the beginning of the first Opium War, when huge numbers of Chinese became addicted. They estimate that by the first Opium War, 1 in 4 Chinese men were using opium regularly, and there were millions of hardcore addicts that really just became dysfunctional messes. The production was going down. People weren't working that were addicted to opium. Their economy was sagging, and the economy was already in trouble. So this just exacerbated problems they were having. All right, and the Emperor Qianlong even sent a letter to the King of England, King George III, and in an excerpt of the letter is basically he says, "Yesterday, your ambassador petitioned my ministers to memorialize me regarding your trade with China. But his proposal is not consistent with our dynastic usage and cannot be entertained. Hitherto, all European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have carried on their trade with the Celestial Empire and Canton for centuries. Such has been the procedure for many years. Although our Celestial Empire possesses all things in prolific abundance, we lack no products within our own borders. In other words, we don't need you to bring things in. Just buy what you wish, pay us in silver, and go." All right, and that was his basic opinion. Now you have to realize that this is the Emperor Qianlong, unbelievably powerful guy at the time, the most powerful human being on the face of the planet. The other problems facing the British, of course, was their massive trade deficit with China, and it was growing each year well into the 19th century, and they needed to resolve that because all their silver was being drained into China, and they weren't getting any silver back. They weren't selling anything. And this is one of the big motivations for smuggling the opium, regardless of China's own laws prohibiting it. Because it would be paid for with silver, right? So that's what they were doing. And they were manufacturing it in India in huge amounts and shipping it over there. At any rate, numerous efforts were made by the Chinese to limit the trade, and it was all to no avail. The Chinese became increasingly addicted, and during the 1830s, it all came to a head with the First Opium War, and it was following the death, and this is something that doesn't get much coverage. The Emperor Daoguan's son, during the 1830s, died from opium. He died from an overdose, along with all the other millions of people in China that were using it, and the emperor was just getting really, really fed up with it. And they attempted to stop it, and it resulted in the First Opium War. They had some basic agreements that came about. They couldn't really get them implemented. The English kept trying to expand the agreements, and everything came to a standstill until they had the Second Opium War, which was really the beginning of the end for China. All right, and it began under Prince Kung, who was the representative of the emperor at that time, working with Lord Elgin, who we'll talk a bit about today, and the French government. So the British and the French were there trying to negotiate some sort of a deal. And the question is, why did France and Britain loot and destroy the Summer Palace? All right, and why did they basically steal or destroy everything that was in the place? And this includes the contents of over 3,000 buildings on a property roughly the size of Central Park in New York. And they wanted to have this agreement and so forth, and they were working it out at the end of the Second Opium War. Things got a little bit nasty. And on September 18th, in 1860, the Brits under Lord Elgin in France, who were represented by Lord Montauban, sent 39 emissaries to negotiate the Treaty of Tientsin. And this was the 1850s treaty, the new treaty, with China's Prince Kung, who was negotiating on the behalf of the emperor. And this was how things were done back then. And they'd had gotten nowhere for a while, heading into September. It had been going on for several years. Elgin had gone back on his word a number of times, and Prince Kung didn't trust him. So the Brits sent 39 emissaries. The British and the French sent a combined total of 39 emissaries to negotiate this treaty. And Prince Kung didn't trust him to live up to his word, and you're going to find out in a minute that he was correct. And so he decided to detain them all. Now, he didn't hurt them. The rumor was that he detained all these people and he just executed them. That is not true. That is not what happened. And this is a fabrication of Lord Elgin and the British historians. The French don't push this too much, but the British they created this fantasy about what happened to justify what they did, which had been long planned. This is the thing that you find out. The British and the French had a deal to divide the spoils that was put in writing before they even left Europe. that they knew they were going to probably do this. All right, and at any rate, Prince Kung detained all of these guys, and because by this time goodwill was pretty much wiped out between the two parties. They didn't trust each other. The British kept attacking and invading and moving into areas where they said they wouldn't, and so forth. And the Chinese were very anxious to get this agreement done, to get things back to normal, to stabilize their country. And there were a few simple requirements that they were asking for that were easily resolved, and they soon had an agreement. This began in earnest on the 18th when they held the emissaries to do the negotiating, and they soon had an agreement. And 17 of the detainees were released immediately as soon as they had the groundwork agreed to. They said, "Fine, half of you can go. The other are going to remain until the agreement is signed." All right, because the Chinese at this point didn't trust the British. Remember, Britain invaded China. Britain attacked China in order to do business. All right, the Chinese didn't want it. They liked things the way it was. The English didn't want anything to do with it. So they just decided they were going to go in there and bully their way around. And that's what the British did. The British and the French both went in and bullied China into this agreement. At any rate, on the 6th of October, Prince Kung formally agreed to meet Elgin and sign the treaty in Peking on the 8th of October. And at that point, they would release all of the emissaries. All right. The problem was that on that same day, on October 6th, the British and French troops arrived at the outskirts of the Summer Palace complex and could see what was in there. And they had no intention of letting the opportunity of this kind of plunder to slip away, as it would be gone once the agreement was signed. They couldn't do anything about it. All right. And the looting began on the 8th, the very day that Elgin had agreed or had been offered to sign the agreement. He claims he was there to get this agreement signed, but when he was offered the chance to sign it in just 2 days, the offer came on the 6th. The same day they arrived at the outskirts of the Summer Palace, where the emperor wasn't staying. There was nobody staying there other than some eunuchs and some staff, because it wasn't the right season. The emperor was up in the mountains at another palace, and Prince Kung was in Beijing. So they were there. Greed kicked in, and they began looting the place. And that's basically the deal. Now, they claim that the French looted it first. The French say the British were there the whole time. There's a lot of confusion about who did what when. But what we do know is that by the 8th, the place was being fully sacked, and everything was either being destroyed or stolen out of the place. Now, this was a property that had 1.5 million objects in it, roughly, according to everybody. A few Westerners say, no, it's a little over 1 million. Others, the Chinese, say, no, it's about 1.5 million objects. But it's somewhere in there. It's a huge number. And they began looting and destroying everything. And basically what happened was Elgin lied to Prince Kung. He never attended the signing. He never followed up with it. And he just sort of went off the radar as far as the negotiations went, because they were looting. They were getting the stuff. They were loading the stuff on trucks, arranging it on carts, rather. Not trucks. They didn't have trucks, but on carts, getting things shipped out of the area. They were Elgin was orchestrating auctions so they could sell some of the stuff off to pay the soldiers. All of this was going on. And on October 12th, Kung asked Elgin to stop the looting, knowing that he could if he wanted to. And he was apparently unaware at that time that the looting had already been mostly done. There wasn't much they could do about it. Elgin never responded. So again, on October 14th, Elgin got another message from Prince Kung following his request on the 12th of October. He sent another one on the 14th saying, please stop it. And he released 2 emissaries, but he ordered 2 of his detainees killed and had the bodies sent back. And this was in response to the looting of the palace. This was considered a huge insult, and it would anywhere in the world. If a foreign force went in and looted Buckingham Palace, and the English were holding a couple of dozen detainees for a negotiation, they would have killed a few of them too. Any rate, it went on from there, and on the 15th of October, Elgin, in retaliation for the killing of the 2 emissaries. Now keep in mind, he purposely apparently avoided signing the agreement, ending the war, so that he could loot the place. His soldiers were ordered to burn the summer palace to the ground on the 18th. And this was on the 15th. So the day after they killed a couple of the British detainees, Elgin escalated it by ordering not only that they clean out the palace and steal everything that wasn't nailed down for their own benefit, he wanted the entire complex destroyed. Further, he pushed to have the palace in Beijing destroyed if the Chinese didn't kowtow and come around to his way of thinking, whatever that was. Because at this point, he hadn't agreed to do anything. At any rate, at that point, once it was announced that they were gonna destroy the palace, it put Prince Kung in a very difficult position. And when they destroyed the palace, he had the rest of the emissaries executed because he assumed all hope was lost. And finally, apparently Elgin or somebody reached out to somebody, and they got the agreement finally signed on the 24th of October. And France signed it on the 25th. The money was paid that they demanded that the Chinese pay as reparations, of all things, if you can imagine. It would be sort of like if the Mexican drug cartels invaded the U.S. and got their heroin confiscated, and then in order for them to stop, they wanted the U.S. government to reimburse them for their stolen drugs. That's basically what happened. But the interesting part about this whole story was that in history, they make it look like the looting, the looting just sort of happened. And that the looting and the sacking were two very separate events. And they try to present in history that those two events were combined, and that's why the execution and the looting all happened because Prince Kung ordered the execution of the big group of 18 or 19 emissaries that were sent, and that wasn't true. That happened in response to the sacking and looting of the palace of over 1.5 million objects. And back then, that wouldn't have been considered an outrageous act by any country in the world were it to happen to them. But the thing that was very interesting was before the French and the British ever went to China to try to negotiate some sort of a deal and bring in their troops to sort of force a deal, in March of 1860, a convention was signed between Her Majesty Victoria and the Emperor of France relative to the joint captures, as it was called in China, and how booty arising from these activities would be divided equally. This was a big thing. So what they did was they went over, they gathered in Paris privately and secretly and said, listen, we're going to go to China, we're going to get some loot, we're going to do real well over there, and we have to have an agreement before we go on how we're going to divide the property. And amazingly, the British and the French were sticklers to making sure everything got divided properly from the imperial collection when they stole it. So they knew full well that this was likely to happen. And when Prince Kung agreed to sign the agreement on the 8th, and the British were already at the palace on the outskirts of the summer palace, the Yuan Ming Yuan, on the 6th, it was very obvious that Elgin wasn't signing anything until they got their taste of the booty out of this place, and which they went ahead and did, and ignored the requests, the emphatic requests, to sign the agreement that we'd all worked out. The agreement was fully. It's funny because the agreement for peace was fully finished in September, and they were basically doing the paperwork. They were all, according to Prince Kung, they thought they were all on the same page. The British had sent some emissaries to them to negotiate it and work it out. He held on to them to make sure the British followed through with what they agreed to. And Elgin just threw a monkey wrench into the deal by going into the palace and stealing all the stuff. That's along with the French. Now the French, when a lot of the stuff that they stole and took, ended up being given to Napoleon III's wife, Eugenia, and they put it all in a museum at the Fontainebleau, and it's quite a collection. It's still there today, and they don't make a lot of excuses for how it got there. They basically say right up front that this was all taken from the Summer Palace during our military operations over there. The British, on the other hand, when Elgin got back to Britain, there was a lot of negative stuff coming out about what the hell did you people do over there? What do you mean you sacked the palace? What do you mean you stole all this stuff? So they had to come up with a story that could justify the sacking, that could justify the burning down of this palace, because Queen Victoria herself expressly asked that there be no unnecessary destruction of property or cultural aspects. Everything was to be left as it is. We don't want to make things worse. All right. And Elgin falsely wrote a letter claiming that the treaty was signed because he had sacked and looted the palace, which in fact is untrue, because they had already agreed to sign it 2 weeks before before the looting and the sacking took place, basically. And they came to a formal date of the 8th of October by the 6th, so they were well on their way. The sacking of the Yuan Ming Yuan took place on the 8th, the day they were supposed to sign the agreement, and they burned the place on the 18th, a couple of weeks later, allegedly in retribution for the killing of the soldiers. But it wasn't that at all. The remaining soldiers were killed because Elgin ordered the destruction of the palace. That came first. Then they killed the detainees. All right, and Elgin just basically lied to anybody that would listen to him, even though everybody knew it was untrue. He even tried to drag the French into it, saying the French were involved with the sacking or involved with the destruction of the palace. They admitted they were involved with the looting, but they said point blank always they had tried to discourage Elgin from destroying the palace physically, tearing down the complex and wrecking it, because the French viewed it as a national treasure, even despite all of the circumstances. You can't do that. And they were fishing around as well to see if the French would be willing to help them invade the imperial palace in Beijing or Peking at the time, and they absolutely said absolutely not. Elgin's own people said absolutely not. At any rate, they went on. Elgin kept insisting that the French helped destroy the palace, and it was all a lie. And he beat that horse until the day he died, and he claimed that he never got any of the loot from the palace, that he never did any of it, which was also a lie. And it's an interesting thing, because once it was all over, there was a flood of imperial Chinese art all over Europe, which there had never been before. According to Jessica Harrison Hall, who's a curator, she's alive today, at the British Museum, they've gone through their records and said there's basically almost no imperial art in the UK prior to the time of the sacking of the Yuan Ming Yuan. They didn't have it. It wasn't traded. It wasn't brought over as trade goods. And if you examine the accession dates of most of the imperial porcelain in the Victoria and Albert Museum and in the British museums and other big institutions that have these suspect pieces in them, you'll notice that the accession dates are all well after October of 1860, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, because following the sacking of the Yuan Ming Yuan, there were about 5 or 6 dozen auctions held in England and in France in the ensuing years, and there have been many since then. All right, and this is how the stuff was all dispersed. But what's really interesting was that over the time, since the sacking, originally there were many things that were offered for sale that were advertised as being from the old summer palace, as it was referred to, and that it would help push up the value. It made it more interesting. And then there were all these collections that were turning up that belonged to soldiers, one fellow named Negroni in particular. And then there's, of course, the Franks collection, which was the collection that belonged to one of the curators at the British Museum, who doubled the size of his Chinese collection by 1879 by buying actively in France at the auctions of the looted material. And this kind of stuff just went on and on and on. But as time has gone on, the Fontainebleau, the British museums, all these places are quietly removing the descriptors that go with these objects when they're on display, indicating their history. And they'll say, well, it was acquired by the museum in 1870, acquired by the museum in 1865. gifted by somebody, and then when you look up who the person that gifted it was, the family is a descendant of somebody who was there as a soldier, because there were 4,000 or 5,000 British soldiers and another five or so thousand French soldiers there who a lot of them got things, brought them home, and then distributed them. One of the most famous, of course, is the Font Hill collection that was started by Alfred Morrison. Well, Alfred Morrison acquired most of his great objects, the imperial objects. He bought from Lord Locke of Drylaw, who served as the private secretary to Lord Elgin in China. All right, this is where the stuff came from. And if you look at the history of the provenances in the auction catalogs of things that came from Font Hill or Alfred Morrison, you'll see the ownership right before it is nearly always Lord Locke. And the reason was that Lord Locke sent home huge amounts of imperial art that he plundered and then sold to Alfred Morrison, who was an antiquarian collector. He had an interest in the arts and so forth, and he bought all of it. And then over the years, Font Hill has become synonymous with the Summer Palace loot. That's when people if you see Font Hill, think Summer Palace. I mean, that's sort of how it goes. And since then, these objects have been regularly sold at auction. They've been gifted to museums, gathered by collectors across the globe, many of which during the last 25 years were bought also by Chinese nationals who are now, China's got a boom in their economy. Chinese citizens have become interested in their art. They're buying it and repatriating it, which is a good thing. All right. Many of the pieces end up in museums or in private museums or in public museums or just in private collections. But at least they're getting back to China. And today, museums and auction houses have large collections of this loot. They estimate that there are over 2,000 museums around the world that house objects from the Palace Museum. I mean, from the Yuan Ming Yuan, rather. And that they're in over 47 countries scattered around the globe. They're everywhere. All right. And many of them have been there for 100 years, all starting at that time when this was done. And as I said, these museums are all doing as much as they can to obscure as much as possible the origin and sources of where these came from, because it's an embarrassment. And they know that there's going to be a lot of pressure for them to return it. And the Chinese have been pressuring these countries to return the pieces. There's a famous Zodiac bronzes that were at the sale at Christie's in Paris that belonged to Yves Saint Laurent, and then went to his partner Pierre Berge, and eventually they did find their way back to China through the ownership of the fellow who owns Christie's negotiated deals to return them. He wanted to do the right thing, and it benefited Christie's because they suddenly had new opportunities to do business in China with that. So it all works out. But this is the history of it. This is what happened. And it wasn't a matter of the Chinese just on one side taking these aggressive steps. It really began with the British trying to force them into accepting more and more and more opium. And as China's economy was declining, the other thing that happened was the British realized they had to increase the amount of opium going in to get more money coming out, because there was less and less silver in the Chinese economy, which just further accelerated the decline over there of what was going on. And meanwhile, the emperor is pleading with the British and the French to not invade, not bring any more opium in, stop attacking our ports, and so forth. Britain was France were purely the aggressors over there. The Chinese did nothing to provoke it. They had opened their borders, and the Chinese were in return basically addicted to opium, so that the British could balance their books through the East India Company. And that's what happened. But it had nothing to do with the Chinese doing anything of an aggressive nature towards the British. This was all the British, and it was in particular Lord Elgin lying to his counterparts in China, who claims he was trying to make a deal with, and he deceived them and ended up robbing them. And his lies to the British Crown and to the British people about what really happened, because he knew he'd blown it. He knew he had been completely in the wrong. And as they say, the apple didn't fall far from the tree, because his father was the guy, of course, who looted the Elgin marbles out of Greece, and those are apparently going back. The last story I read, that the British are going to return them because it's just too embarrassing to keep them any longer. And hopefully, maybe the British museums will man up, and some of these other institutions, and do something to compensate for what happened from years ago. Because it wasn't just war loot; it was outright robbery, and most of the pieces now are in big museums and in very large collections, and they need to be accounted for. So there we are. That's the long and long of it, and hope you found it interesting. And have a good week. We'll be back with another video later this week, and subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. Okay. Bye-bye.